The overhead fluorescent lights hummed low over the worn vinyl booths of Miller's Family Diner, the kind of suburban Georgia spot where coffee stays hot and the air always smells like fried onions and fresh-baked pie. It was early evening, the dinner rush winding down. Families trickled in and out, forks clinked against ceramic plates, and a steady stream of traffic rumbled past out on the 4-lane highway. I pulled into the gravel parking lot, tired from wrapping up a long day of security consulting client calls. I'd promised my mother Marge I would meet her here for supper. Marge was 72, a retired librarian with soft silver-gray hair pulled back loosely in a knit scarf. Arthritis gnawed at her wrists most days, and she moved slow, careful with every step. She hated being a burden, always insisted she could handle everything on her own, even when her body betrayed her. I worried about her constantly. 5 years out from my Army Ranger captain commission, I still carried that old instinct, to watch over, to anticipate danger before it landed. Most days I kept that part of my past locked away. My neighbors and local clients only knew me as Lila Marlowe, the quiet private security consultant, not the woman who had trained to lead teams through high-stakes missions overseas. Few people asked about my service, and I rarely volunteered it. When I pushed open the diner's glass front door, the bell above the frame jingled. Something was already wrong. Voices rose sharp above the usual restaurant noise. Tables had turned. Patients leaned forward in their seats, phones lifted halfway, nobody moving to step in. My pulse kicked up fast, the old military reflex firing before I could think. I scanned the room and spotted my mother. She was crumpled on the scuffed linoleum floor beside a booth, her purse spilled open across the tile. Paper receipts and reading glasses scattered everywhere. One wrist twisted awkwardly underneath her. A broad-shouldered man in a stained work flannel stood over her, jaw tight, face flushed with rage. He had just shoved her hard enough to send her tumbling backward. "Just move along, old lady," he barked down at her. "I wanted this booth. You should have gotten up faster." That was Damon Voss. I learned his name only moments later. He was a local building contractor, well known around these outer suburb circles. Money in his pocket, connections spread through town, the kind of man who expected the world to bend to his temper. Other diners stared, but no one intervened. Some looked away, uncomfortable, unwilling to get dragged into a stranger's explosive conflict. The server froze halfway across the dining room. I crossed the room in long, quick strides. Every muscle in my body screamed for physical retaliation. Years of combat training lived in my bones. I knew exactly how to disable him before he could raise a hand again, but I bit it down hard. If I struck him first, I would become the problem. My license, my consulting business, every part of my civilian life would shatter in one reckless second. That was the trap he was setting without even knowing who I was. I knelt beside Marge instead, lowering myself carefully to the floor. My voice stayed steady, even though my hands shook slightly as I brushed fallen hair from her face. "Mom, look at me. Can you tell me where it hurts?" Her breath came in shallow little gasps. Tears streamed down her cheeks. "My wrist," she whispered. I lost my balance when he pushed me. Damon stepped closer, towering over both of us. She was holding my table. "I didn't do all that much. Don't make a big scene out of nothing." I stood slowly and faced him. My posture stayed relaxed, shoulders loose, but my gaze never left his. "You pushed a 72-year-old woman to the ground. That is not nothing." He laughed short and bitter, completely unrepentant. "Whatever. People get bumped into all the time in diners." The diner manager Jesse Torres hurried over then, face pale, clearly caught between upset customers and a powerful regular client. He called for an ambulance while other guests finally started offering help to get Marge upright. I guided my mother onto a hard plastic chair, held her injured wrist gently supported in my lap while we waited for paramedics. Damon didn't apologize once. He grabbed his jacket off the back of a chair, tossed a few bills onto his table, and threw one last sharp warning my way before walking out toward the parking lot. "Think twice before you start picking fights you can't win around here." The front door slammed shut behind him. The diner bell jingled again, hollow and cold. Paramedics loaded Marge into the back of the ambulance. I rode in the passenger seat of my own car and followed them to the emergency room. Bright sterile hospital lights burned my eyes. When the doctor came out 35 minutes later, the news landed heavy in my chest. Marge had a fractured wrist from the fall. Beyond the physical injury, the panic and shock of what had happened lingered in every trembling breath she took. I leaned against the cold tile wall of the emergency department hallway, staring down at my phone. I had filed the police report already, given the dispatcher every detail I could recall. But deep inside, I understood clearly. Calling the police was only the first small step. Damon Voss had money and influence in this county. He would not simply accept consequences quietly. Whatever came next would not end with one police report. The safe, quiet routine our family had built had fractured right alongside my mother's bone. Something told me the worst was still ahead of us. The fluorescent glow of the ER waiting room never dims, flat and unforgiving, stripping away every pretense of calm you try to hold on to. I sat on the rigid plastic bench long after the doctor had reset my mother's fractured wrist and fitted her with a hard fiberglass cast, my elbows braced on my knees, eyes fixed on the scuffed linoleum floor. Marge dozed weakly in the hospital recliner beside me, pain medication softening her features. But every so often she'd flinch in her sleep, a quiet, involuntary jerk that told me her nervous system was still replaying the fall over and over again. It was past 9 at night, the dinner rush long dead, and the only sounds filling the room were distant monitor beeps and the quiet shuffle of hospital staff footsteps. I'd finished the official police report an hour earlier, speaking to a uniformed officer who'd been polite but routine. He jotted down my statement, noted Marge's injury, and explained the slow, bureaucratic process of a misdemeanor assault case. No immediate arrest, no urgent follow-up, just a case number and a generic promise that someone would review the footage and witness statements in the coming days. Officer Bennett made it clear that without solid, unbroken surveillance or cooperative eyewitnesses, the case could easily stall out. I nodded while he talked, but cold reality settled heavy inside my chest. Damon Voss was not some random stranger off the street. He had roots here. We brought Marge home close to midnight. I helped her shuffle into her small single-story house, locked every window, and double-checked each front door deadbolt before I left. Her old house had never felt so vulnerable. I drove back to my own place, my mind racing through every detail of the diner, replaying Damon's face, his sharp parting warning. Sleep barely came. The next morning my phone buzzed before 7. The caller ID showed no name. When I answered, a man's gruff voice came over the line, and I recognized Damon almost instantly. He did not sound apologetic. He sounded annoyed, as if we were the ones creating an inconvenience for him. I want to make this whole mess go away, he said bluntly. I know there's a hospital bill. I can write you a check. $5,000. Cashable today. You drop the police report, and we forget any of this ever happened. My fingers tightened around the phone. You pushed a 72-year-old woman onto a hard floor. Money does not erase that. People get hurt in accidents, he shot back. It was a stupid argument over a booth. No one needs their life dragged through local police files over something trivial. Think about your mother. Think about the stress this will put her through. It struck me then. He was framing his own violent act as my burden to manage. I ended the call without agreeing to anything, and less than 2 hours later an envelope showed up on my front porch, slipped under the gate. Inside was exactly the check he had mentioned, plus a short typed note that carried an undertone of threat. Settle this reasonably, and no one gets hurt. I took the check straight to my kitchen counter and stared at it. Part of me understood the temptation. Marge's medical copays would stack up fast, but cashing it meant signing away any chance at real accountability. It meant letting Damon walk free, convinced violence could always be bought off. I texted Becca Hale, my closest friend who worked as a legal assistant downtown, and told her everything. She called me back within minutes, her tone tight with worry. Lila, those settlement offers are traps, she warned. If you cash that check, you will have almost no legal ground left later. But you need to understand what you're walking into. Damon Voss's contracting firm does tons of business with county subcontractors. He knows people. Fighting him will not be quick or easy. Later that afternoon I drove over to Miller's Diner, hoping to secure the security camera footage before anything could happen to it. The dining room was quiet, mid-lunch lull, plates stacked behind the counter. I found Jesse Torres in the back office, door half closed. When I asked to review the surveillance recordings, his shoulders tensed. He avoided meeting my eyes. The system's glitchy, he mumbled. Some camera feeds cut out randomly. I'm not sure how much usable footage we actually have from last night. His evasiveness stung. I could feel him pulling away. I pressed gently, asking for whatever clips still existed, but he kept hedging, saying he would look into it and get back to me. He never gave me a yes or no. I left the diner empty-handed, unsettled. By dusk I had mailed the $5,000 check back to Damon's business address, return to sender, unendorsed. Within an hour my cell phone pinged with a short, icy text message from an unknown number. You just made a very bad decision. I locked my front door and walked over to the front window, pulling the curtain back just enough to peer out onto my driveway. Parked at the far edge of the street sat a dark-colored SUV. Its engine idled low. No one got out. It simply sat there, watching my house. The dark SUV was gone by sunrise, but its presence lingered like a shadow behind every window in my house. I did not sleep well that night. Every faint creak from the front yard pulled me upright in bed, my senses sharp, old muscle memory from deployments humming under my skin. I had spent years learning how to read threats, how to separate real danger from simple paranoia, and this felt tangible. This was not imagination. Early the next morning, I pulled out the locked storage box from the back of my closet. Inside sat my old service-issued tactical notebook, reference manuals, and my retired Ranger captain identification card. I had kept these items locked away for years, rarely opening the lid. Civilian life had taught me to blend in, to downplay my military background so clients and neighbors would see me as approachable, not hardened. Now I flipped through the worn pages, running my fingers over notes on evidence preservation and threat assessment. I was not going to march out looking for a fight, but I would no longer wait passively for bad things to unfold. I started with practical home security. I ordered new reinforced deadbolts online, picked up window contact sensors from the local hardware store, and set up extra outdoor cameras around my property. Every device recorded directly to cloud storage, so footage could not simply be stolen or erased if someone tried to tamper with my system. I also drove over to Marge's house and installed identical sensors on her doors and windows. She watched me work with quiet worry, her cast-covered wrist resting in a soft fabric sling. "Lila, you don't have to turn both our homes into fortresses," she said softly. "Maybe we should just let this fade away. I hate all this tension hanging over us." I knelt down beside her chair, keeping my tone gentle. "I wish we could. But he already sent threats. If we back off now, there is nothing stopping him from pushing further later." She sighed and looked away. I could tell the trauma of being thrown to the diner floor still haunted her. She wanted peace, even if it meant swallowing the injustice. My heart ached for her, yet I could not bring myself to step back. Once the home safeguards were in place, I headed back toward Miller's Diner. Lunch rush was in full swing. The dining room filled with customers, waitstaff hurrying between tables. I found Jesse behind the counter after the midday crowd died down, and asked again about the security footage. His jaw tightened, and he glanced nervously toward the front door, as though afraid Damon might walk in at any moment. "I told you the system glitches," he repeated. "Half the cameras cut out during peak hours. I went through the files this morning. The angle where everything happened is corrupted. Only a handful of fragmented frames survived." "Fragmented is better than nothing," I pressed. "I need whatever you have. Even blurry clips matter." He hesitated for a long moment before copying the damaged surveillance snippets onto a USB drive and handing it over. His hands shook slightly as he passed it across the counter. "Please understand my position," he muttered, voice low. "Damon brings in huge groups for business dinners. He spends a lot of money here. If I openly go against him, my job is on the line. The owner will not protect me from financial losses." I took the USB and understood his fear, even if it frustrated me. He was giving me what little he dared, yet he would not commit to giving a formal witness statement to police. I left the diner holding incomplete evidence, knowing full well fragments alone would not carry our case. That afternoon I called Damon directly. I kept my voice level, no shouting, no emotional outbursts. I laid out plainly that we would not accept hush money, that we intended to pursue every legal avenue available. "Leave my mother and me alone," I told him. "Any further harassment goes straight to the detective assigned to our case." Damon laughed over the phone, cold and dismissive. "You think a few police reports scare me? You have no idea who you are messing with. You will regret digging in your heels like this." When the call ended, I sat at my desk and plugged the USB drive into my laptop. The video files were grainy, choppy, jumping between frames. I could see Marge fall, but key moments were missing. It was not enough to conclusively prove every detail of the assault. Something critical had been lost. I leaned back in my office chair and opened the old military notebook once more. I was no longer only waiting for police to move the case forward. I would conduct my own careful investigation, staying strictly within legal bounds. It would cost me time from my consulting work, and it would draw more of Damon's anger toward me. That was the price I had to accept. I shut the notebook closed and glanced out my office window toward the street. I did not see the dark SUV today, yet I could not shake the feeling that eyes were watching. The battle was no longer only about what had happened inside that diner. It was about what would happen next. The fragmented diner footage played on a loop across my laptop screen late that evening. Frames skipped, colors washed out, key seconds vanished into digital static. I could make out Marge stumbling backward, the flash of Damon's raised arm, but the exact moment of contact blurred into distortion. It would not hold up as ironclad proof in front of anyone. No detective, no judge, no jury would build a whole case around broken clips. I closed the media player and rubbed my eyes, exhaustion settling heavy behind them. The next morning I met Becca at a small downtown coffee shop. Sunlight filtering through tall glass windows over our mugs of black coffee. I laid the USB drive on the table between us and told her exactly what Jesse had given me. My frustration spilled over before I could rein it in. I told her I believed Jesse had deliberately erased critical segments to protect his profitable regular customer. Becca leaned back in her chair and stirred her coffee slowly, her expression careful. "Lila, that is a serious assumption. You only have partial information. Jesse could genuinely be afraid. That is not the same thing as covering up for Damon." I shook my head, my temper frayed by days of sleepless nights and quiet threats. He held on to this for days. He knew exactly what that camera was supposed to capture. He dragged his feet every single time I asked for it. Our conversation shifted sharp, the easy comfort we usually shared fraying at the edges. Becca warned me that letting suspicion cloud my judgment could burn one of the very few potential witnesses we had left. She reminded me I was used to clear-cut missions, where threats wore uniforms and rules were written down. Civilian disputes were messy, full of people trapped between fear and survival. I did not want to hear it. In my mind, Jesse had already chosen sides, and it was not ours. We parted with cool politeness, no real resolution reached. For the first time since this whole ordeal started, I felt genuinely alone. I spent the rest of the day digging through public court records on my home computer. Piece by piece, I pulled up Damon Voss's civil history. 3 prior complaints filed against him over the last 8 years. 2 involved workplace altercations with subcontractors, 1 was a dispute with a former business partner. Every single one had ended in confidential out-of-court settlements. No criminal charges ever stuck. Money had smoothed every conflict down to nothing. It painted a clear pattern. When cornered, Damon paid to make problems disappear. That evening I drove past Miller's Diner once more. I did not go inside. I sat in my car across the street and watched Jesse through the front glass as he moved between tables. Part of me wanted to storm in and confront him for what I believed he had hidden, but I forced myself to drive away. Burning that bridge completely would leave us with 0 eyewitnesses. Still, resentment lingered heavy inside me. I sent Jesse a short, sharp text asking whether he would reconsider giving a formal statement to the police. He never replied. Marge's mental state grew more fragile as the days dragged on. She kept replaying the fall in her head. Small, loud noises made her flinch. A car slamming its door in her driveway would make her jump. She kept begging me to drop everything, to stop digging up trouble. She hated living with the constant low-grade fear hanging over both our houses. I understood her fear, yet backing down meant Damon got away scot-free. I could not bring myself to do that. By nearly midnight I sat hunched over my desk, going over every piece of evidence I had stacked together. Medical reports, police case paperwork, the glitchy surveillance files, screenshots of Damon's threatening text messages. The stack felt substantial, yet every piece had some kind of flaw. Nothing formed an unbreakable chain. I kept circling back to Jesse, convinced he was the one holding the missing link. My frustration blinded me to other possibilities. My phone lit up on the desk. A text popped up from an unknown number. No greeting, no signature. Just a short, plain line. I saw what happened at the diner that night. Jesse didn't delete the footage. He just isn't allowed to talk. My breath caught. I stared down at the screen, rereading those words again and again. Someone else had been there. A separate witness I had never known existed. My heart lifted for half a second before cold caution kicked in. This could be a trap. It could be Damon trying to feed me false information to lead me astray. I typed back slowly, asking who they were, asking them to meet somewhere public. No reply came. The sender went radio silent. I sat there in the dim glow of my desk lamp, staring at the empty message thread. A new possibility had opened up, yet I had no idea whether it was real, or whether I was walking straight into another trap. I kept checking my phone through the early hours of the morning, waiting for the anonymous sender to write back. The screen stayed dark. Sleep never really came. My mind cycled through every possibility. It could be a genuine witness. It could be Damon feeding me bait to waste my time. It might even be some random stranger online playing cruel games. I could not afford to trust blindly, yet I also could not afford to ignore the lead entirely. The next afternoon I drove past the diner again, this time choosing a different coffee shop 2 blocks away, where I could watch the front entrance without drawing attention. I sipped cold coffee and watched customers flow in and out. Every person who exited made me wonder if it was the one who had texted me. Hours slipped by with no sign. Just as I was about to pack up and leave, a young woman in a faded diner uniform walked out the side service door, lighting a cigarette with shaking fingers. She glanced over both streets before pulling out her phone. My own device vibrated seconds later. Another unknown number text popped onto my screen. I am the evening hostess. I was working that night. I can't speak on restaurant property. Meet me in the grocery store parking lot 10 minutes from here, after my shift ends at 9. Come alone. My pulse ticked higher. This was real. I sent back one short confirmation and drove over to the large supermarket lot, circling the rows of parked cars until dusk rolled in. I kept my vehicle angled so I could see anyone approaching. I brought no weapons, only my notebook and my phone set to record audio discreetly in my pocket. 89 sharp, a beat-up old sedan pulled into the spot beside mine. The hostess climbed out. Her name was Clara. She was 24, had worked weekend evening shifts at Miller's Diner for nearly 2 years. She slid into my passenger seat, kept her head low, and spoke in fast, quiet bursts. Afraid someone might spot her, she told me exactly what had unfolded that night. Damon had snapped because Marge had sat down at a booth he had mentally claimed for himself. There had been no real argument. He had simply demanded she move, and when Marge had tried to gather her things slowly because of her arthritis, he shoved her hard with both hands. Clara had seen the whole sequence clearly from the host stand. Then she explained Jesse's behavior. He had not erased surveillance files. Damon had called the diner owner the very next morning, threatening to pull all his company's large group catering contracts worth tens of thousands of dollars if Jesse gave any damaging statement to police. The owner had ordered Jesse to stay silent, under threat of termination. Jesse had been trapped between his job and what he knew was right. He had handed over whatever broken footage he could safely extract, and nothing more. A sharp twist of guilt settled in my chest. I had painted Jesse as a corrupt accomplice, when he was just another person trapped under Damon's economic pressure. My own frustration and exhaustion had pushed me to a terrible misjudgment. Clara would not give an official sworn statement yet. She lived paycheck to paycheck, and she feared retaliation against her own job. But she gave me a detailed verbal account, and told me Jesse wanted to help, he just dared not risk everything openly. She slipped out of my car quickly, afraid of being recognized, and drove away into the dark. I sat there in the empty supermarket parking lot for a long time, processing everything I had learned. My earlier assumptions crumbled completely. I needed to make amends with Jesse, and find some way to give him safety so he could step forward. When I got back to Marge's house late that night, I found her sitting awake on her couch. All the lights were on. She had not slept. Nightmares kept dragging her back to that diner floor. Her cast-covered wrist rested on a throw pillow, and her hands trembled. Seeing her like this drove home how high the personal cost of this fight really was. 2 days later, I worked up the courage to go back to the diner and find Jesse. I apologized plainly for misjudging him. Told him I now understood the pressure the owner and Damon had put on him. He stared at me with tired, defeated eyes. He admitted he wanted to tell the truth, but he had rent to pay and no other job lined up. There was very little he could risk. Word must have gotten back to Damon fast that new eyes had seen the assault. Late that same afternoon, an official complaint landed in my business email inbox. A client had supposedly filed a grievance claiming I had delivered unprofessional, reckless security consulting services. No specific examples were listed. It was vague, anonymous, and timed perfectly. It could tank my small consulting practice if the local licensing board chose to investigate. I stared at the complaint text glowing on my screen. Damon was no longer only threatening my family. He had started attacking my livelihood. The fight had just expanded into territory I never expected. The anonymous complaint sat in my business inbox like a ticking clock. No name, no concrete incidents, just broad accusations of unprofessional conduct. My consulting license operated under state oversight. Even an unsubstantiated grievance could trigger a formal review. Investigations took months. Clients grew skittish. Reputations were easy to stain and hard to scrub clean. Damon knew exactly which buttons to push. He was not swinging fists. He was trying to erase my ability to fight back at all. I spent the better part of one afternoon gathering copies of my client contracts, past project reports, and email threads to build my defense file. Every hour I poured into this was time I could not spend building the case for Marge. The weight of everything stacked higher. At dusk I drove over to check on my mother. When I walked through her front door, I found her sitting in the dim living room, television turned off, just staring out the kitchen window. Her cast-swathed wrist lay loosely in its sling. She called me 3 times today, Marge said quietly. Some woman from Damon's office. She kept asking if we would reconsider the settlement. Told me this fight would only make my stress worse. Anger burned cold in my chest. They were reaching her directly now, trying to wear her down. Marge's sleep was still broken. Small unexpected noises still made her flinch. The physical fracture was healing, but the psychological damage lingered. She turned toward me, eyes glistening with exhaustion. Lila, what if we just stop? She whispered. I am alive. My wrist will mend. How much more do we have to lose before this is enough? I had no simple answer for her question. That night I called Becca. I needed her perspective, even after our earlier disagreement. When I laid out the business complaint and the pressure being put on Marge, her tone was heavy. You have already sacrificed so much, Becca said. If the licensing board opens a probe, your whole livelihood hangs in the balance. Marge is traumatized. The witnesses are terrified. Damon has money and connections. There is a real possibility you could lose everything and still get no justice. I am not telling you to surrender. I am telling you to count the cost. Her words landed hard. For the first time I seriously considered walking away. What good was winning a court judgment if I destroyed my career in the process? Becca would not abandon me entirely, but she pulled back from pushing the case forward. She would give me legal information when I asked, yet she would no longer urge me onward. Our partnership shifted into quiet neutrality. I was largely on my own again. I retreated to my home office after that call. I spread all my documents across the desk, hospital records, police case printouts, the corrupted surveillance USB, screenshots of threatening texts, Clara's handwritten notes from our conversation. Every piece of evidence carried a flaw. Clara feared retaliation. Jesse feared losing his job. The video was incomplete. Damon's harassment was mostly indirect, hard to prove in court. Late that night, scrolling back through call logs, I noticed something I had overlooked before. One of Damon's threatening phone calls had been placed from his personal cell, not his business line. I had automatically recorded every incoming call after the SUV started loitering outside my house. I pulled up the audio file. There was his voice, sharp and unguarded, admitting he knew he had upset my mother and promising I would regret my choices. That recording was real, unaltered, time-stamped. It was a genuine paper-thin crack in his armor. Still, one audio clip was not enough to carry the whole case. I sat back in my office chair and stared at the ceiling. Years ago, overseas, when missions went sideways, I had always been part of a team. There were other soldiers beside me. Now this fight fell entirely on my shoulders. I understood the temptation to fold. I could mail another check back, close the police report, let the whole story fade. We could try to rebuild our quiet lives. But I knew what would happen if I did. Damon would learn he could hurt elderly people and buy his way out of consequences. Some other innocent person would become his next target. I leaned forward and stacked every folder neatly. I would not quit. But I would no longer rely on hope that someone else, the police, a witness, luck, would hand me victory. I would build every piece of the argument myself, slow and careful. Outside my office window, the street lamp cast pale yellow light over the empty roadway. No SUV idled there tonight. That did not mean the threat was gone. It only meant he had changed tactics. I reached for my notebook and began outlining step-by-step plans to shore up every weakness in my evidence chain. Whatever Damon threw at me next, I would be ready. Morning light filtered thin through my office blinds the next day, stripping away the fog of exhaustion that had clung to me for weeks. I was no longer operating on reactive fear. I had hit rock bottom, isolated, professionally vulnerable, drowning under the weight of a case full of flawed evidence, and in that empty space, clarity finally settled in. I could not outspend Damon. I could not out-network him. But I could out-prepare him. I started with the one relationship I had damaged through my own stress and misjudgment, Jesse. I arrived at the diner 10 minutes before his shift began, early enough to avoid customer eyes, and waited by the back service entrance. When he stepped out with his lunch cooler slung over his shoulder, he froze for half a second, clearly expecting another confrontation. I spoke before he could shut me out. I apologized fully, plainly, no excuses. I told him I had unfairly assumed corruption when the truth was far simpler. He was a working man trapped between his job and his conscience. I told him I understood the pressure the owner and Damon had piled on him, and that I no longer expected him to risk his livelihood blindly. Jesse stared at me for a long moment, his shoulders slowly dropping their permanent defensive tension. Nobody's ever apologized for misreading this situation, he said quietly. Everyone just assumes I'm either spineless or crooked. I told him I only needed one small, safe thing from him, not a public statement, not a police interview that could get him fired. Just a confidential written account of what he saw, sealed and dated, to be used only if the case advanced to formal hearings. No one at the diner would ever need to know he provided it. After a long hesitation, he nodded. That afternoon, Jesse sent me a password-protected document from his personal email, completely separate from diner servers. Inside was a concise, truthful recount of the altercation, Damon's unprovoked aggression, Marge's slow, confused attempt to move, the deliberate force of the push, and the immediate aftermath of shock and chaos in the dining room. It was not a courtroom testimony yet, but it was verified, time-stamped, and ironclad. Next, I reconnected with Clara. I texted her gratitude for stepping forward and assured her I would never ask her to risk her job unnecessarily. I told her my goal was to build a layered, discrete evidence stack so no single witness bore the entire weight of the case. Relaxed by my restraint, she agreed to a second recorded verbal statement, filling in small critical details I had missed before, the exact words Damon had snarled before shoving Marge, the way he had glared around the room daring anyone to intervene. Piece by piece, the fragmented evidence began locking together. I also revisited the audio recording I'd uncovered the night before. I trimmed dead air, saved multiple encrypted backups, and cross-referenced the timestamp with police report logs to confirm the call had arrived mere hours after Damon's threat at the diner. The audio was crisp enough to capture his tone, arrogant, unremorseful, casually threatening, and it revealed something vital. Damon never denied touching my mother. He only argued it was insignificant. That single admission dismantled his entire potential defense. With my evidence stack stabilizing, I turned toward defending my career. I compiled every client testimonial, project record, and service agreement I had on file, drafting a formal, point-by-point response to the anonymous licensing complaint. I left no room for ambiguity, documenting years of consistent, professional work with zero prior grievances. The complaint still loomed, but it no longer felt like an automatic death sentence for my business. Midway through the day, my phone lit up with an unknown number. I expected another threat or another anonymous probe. Instead, the voice on the line was calm, professional, and belonged to a local civil attorney Becca had quietly recommended behind the scenes. Ms. Marlowe, he said, I've reviewed the summary your friend sent over. The recorded admission plus layered witness accounts gives you tangible grounds to move forward with a formal civil claim. You're no longer chasing speculation. You have a case. For the first time since that night in the diner, the balance of power shifted. Damon had been attacking my life, my career, my peace, relying on my isolation to wear me down. Now I was no longer isolated. I had discrete witness statements, a verbal admission on tape, documented trauma, and a clear legal path forward. That evening, I drove past my mother's neighborhood and slowed at the familiar street where the dark SUV had once idled. It was empty now. Damon's intimidation tactics had gone silent because they had failed. He could scare witnesses, he could file anonymous complaints, he could pressure small business owners, but he could not erase the truth I had systematically preserved. I parked at home and stared at my layered folders, each piece of evidence reinforcing the last. The passive phase of this fight was over. Damon had spent weeks pushing me backward. Now I was finally moving forward, but as I locked my front door for the night, my attorney's final warning echoed in my head: Damon would not stay defeated quietly. A man used to winning with money and pressure would only grow more desperate when his control slipped. His next move would be his most dangerous one yet. The morning sun felt different. For weeks I'd woken up braced for the next threat, a strange car, a hostile email, a shaken phone call from my mother. Today, there was only quiet. But quiet in this fight was never peace. It was the calm before the final play. My new attorney, Elias Grant, walked me through the formal process over a morning call. We had enough evidence to move forward: Jesse's sealed written statement, Clara's corroborating verbal account, the timestamp threat call, full medical records of Marge's fractured wrist and subsequent anxiety symptoms, and the fragmented diner footage that, while incomplete, aligned perfectly with every witness detail. Your case is solid, Elias told me. But Damon Voss doesn't lose without retaliating. People like him don't surrender to evidence. They surrender only when every escape route is burned shut. He was right. That afternoon, I learned exactly what Damon's final escape plan was. Becca reached out to me urgently, her text sharp and rushed. She'd overheard 2 county administrative staff discussing the incoming case. Damon was not planning to settle. He was planning to countersue me for harassment, defamation, and emotional distress. My blood ran cold. The strategy was brutal and textbook. He intended to flip the narrative entirely. He would paint himself as the victim, a local small business owner hounded and harassed by an overzealous, militaristic private consultant obsessed with ruining his reputation. He would claim I'd threatened him, stalked his workplace, pressured diner staff, and manufactured false accusations to destroy his livelihood. If the countersuit landed, I would be buried in legal fees, forced to deplete my savings, and dragged through public court records. Even if I won in the end, my reputation would be scarred. That was his last card, not to win the assault case, but to bankrupt and exhaust me until I folded. I sat down at my desk and processed the new weight settling over me. Up until now, the fight had been about justice for Marge. Now it was also about survival, my career, my finances, my ability to keep protecting my mother without collapsing myself. Becca no longer stayed neutral. She showed up fully, forwarding me public legal precedents, drafting rebuttal language, and helping me organize every text, call log, and photo timestamp that proved I had never initiated contact, never stalked, never harassed. Every move I'd made had been responsive, defensive, rooted entirely in his initial violence and threats. His counterclaim is a bluff, Becca said over the phone that night. But it's an expensive bluff. He's betting you can't afford to outlast him. I knew she was correct. Damon had ongoing company revenue, multiple property holdings, and legal retainers on standby. I ran a small independent consulting business. A prolonged legal battle would drain me quickly. Still, I made my choice without hesitation. I told Elias to file our formal civil complaint first, to beat Damon to the courthouse, to establish our narrative as the official court record before he could file his false counterclaim. The cost would be heavy. I would have to pause client work, drain business reserves, and dedicate every free hour to case preparation. There would be financial strain, stress, and continued public scrutiny. But backing down now meant letting his tactics succeed. It meant teaching him that power and money could overwrite violence. Over the next 2 days, the final pieces of the coalition locked into place. Jesse, emboldened by our discreet setup and the knowledge that we were moving toward resolution, agreed to submit a formal witness statement under seal with the court, protected from immediate public exposure and workplace retaliation. Clara confirmed she would testify if absolutely necessary, willing to step from the shadows once the case became official. For the first time in this entire conflict, every ally was standing firm. The fractured, isolated defense I'd been holding alone had transformed into a structured, unshakable case. Late Thursday afternoon, Elias filed our complaint electronically with county court. The second the submission went through, the system generated a certified filing timestamp. We were official. The battle was no longer a he said she said argument between civilians. It was a legal matter on public record. Damon's team did not wait long to respond. Less than 24 hours later, the official court paperwork arrived at my mailbox. It was not his countersuit. It was a summons. Damon Voss was being formally summoned to answer for misdemeanor assault. And our civil claim for damages was now scheduled for official courtroom adjudication. The balance of power had completely reversed. What began as his attempt to crush me had become his unavoidable day of reckoning. I held the paper in my hands, staring at the printed court letterhead, and felt the weight of months of quiet struggle settle into place. The passive victim phase was over. The hiding, the watching, the waiting, finished. Now there was only the final confrontation. One court hearing. One chance to lay every truth bare. The ultimate showdown was finally, irreversibly, here. The county courthouse smelled like polished wood, old paper, and sterile air conditioning the morning of the hearing. I parked 2 blocks away and walked the rest of the distance, my shoes clicking steady against the concrete sidewalk. I wore a simple dark blazer and tailored trousers, no makeup, no pretense. I did not need to look intimidating. I only needed to be precise. Marge stayed home that day. After weeks of nightmares and anxiety spikes, we agreed she did not need to sit in that cold courtroom and relive the worst moment of her year. She waited at home with her neighbor, her cast finally removed but her lingering cautiousness still visible in every slow movement she made. I would carry our truth for both of us. Elias met me at the courthouse entrance, folder tucked tight under his arm. He briefed me one last time on the procedural rhythm of the hearing. Damon's legal team would attempt to paint the altercation as an accident, frame Marge as uncooperative, and characterize my pursuit of justice as vengeful harassment. Their entire strategy rested on ambiguity, on making the judge doubt intent. Inside the courtroom, the rows stayed nearly empty. Court staff moved quietly through their duties. When the doors swung open and Damon walked in, I felt the shift in the room instantly. He was dressed sharp, buttoned shirt, clean shoes, jaw set hard, accompanied by a high-priced defense attorney with a tailored suit and a cold, bored expression. Damon's eyes scanned the room until they locked onto mine. He did not flinch. He stared, bold and unapologetic, certain his money and status would shield him like they always had. The hearing began swiftly. The state laid out the misdemeanor assault case first. Elias submitted Marge's full medical records, the official police report, the fragmented diner footage, and the time-stamped audio recording of Damon's post-incident threat. When the audio played over the courtroom speakers, the low arrogance in his voice hung in the silent room. No one could miss the unguarded admission. He had acted out of petty impatience, with no regard for Marge's safety. Then the defense took over. True to our prediction, they attempted to rewrite the story. They claimed Marge had refused to move from the booth despite repeated polite requests. They argued her fall was a clumsy reaction, not a result of deliberate force. They painted Damon as a patient customer unfairly targeted by an overaggressive former military veteran looking for a fight. The judge listened silently. Expression neutral. The turning point came when Jesse's sealed witness statement was entered into record, followed by Clara's in-person testimony. Clara stepped forward first, quiet but unshaken. She spoke clearly, without drama, describing exactly what she saw. No repeated requests, no confrontation, just a sudden, impatient shove that sent a frail older woman crashing backward. When the defense tried to rattle her, to suggest she held a grudge against Damon or the restaurant, she held firm. She had no motive to lie. She had everything to lose by speaking up. Then Jesse's written statement reinforced every word she said. 2 independent witnesses, aligned perfectly on every critical detail. Damon's attorney tried to create doubt, pointing to the incomplete surveillance footage, arguing gaps in the video invalidated the testimony. But the judge cut through the noise quickly. Witness testimony does not require perfect video backup, she said firmly. Consistent, corroborated accounts paired with verified injury evidence and a defendant's own recorded admission establish probable cause beyond dispute. I watched Damon's face shift in that moment. The confidence drained from his posture. His jaw tightened. For the first time since this began, he understood his money could not erase the truth. His connections could not pressure this court. His long history of buying settlements had finally failed him. The defense attempted one last desperate maneuver, bringing forward the threat of their countersuit, claiming I had harassed and defamed their client. Elias dismantled it cleanly, presenting every text log, every timestamp, every piece of evidence proving my actions had been responsive, not aggressive. I had never sought out conflict. I had only sought accountability. After violence was inflicted on my family, the judge ruled. From the bench without hesitation, she found probable cause for misdemeanor assault against Damon Voss. She dismissed the threatened countersuit as retaliatory and frivolous in nature, noting it represented clear litigation abuse intended to burden and intimidate the victim's family. She ordered Damon to attend mandatory anger management counseling, pay full restitution for all medical expenses, and complete 200 hours of community service focused on elderly care outreach. Most importantly, the judge ruled the assault charge would remain on his permanent record. No sealed file, no hidden settlement, no erased history. When the ruling landed, the courtroom stayed quiet. Damon stood frozen, his shoulders rigid with suppressed rage. His attorney stared forward, defeated. Months of threats, intimidation, professional sabotage, and psychological pressure collapsed entirely in a single ruling. I did not smile. I did not feel triumphant. A strange, heavy calm settled over me. All I could think about was Marge falling to that diner floor, the sound of her frightened gasp, the weeks of sleepless nights and quiet fear. Justice had arrived, but it had cost us dearly. After the hearing concluded, Damon walked past me on his way out. He slowed, leaning in low enough that only I could hear him. His voice was tight, bitter, stripped of all his earlier arrogance. "This isn't over," he muttered. I watched him leave, the courthouse doors closing behind him. I had won the case, but I knew, with every trained instinct I possessed, that the personal aftermath was only just beginning. The courthouse doors clicked shut behind me, and the weight of months of tension lifted not in a rush, but in slow, quiet increments. The autumn air outside was cool and clean, nothing like the suffocating pressure that had clung to every day since that violent evening at Miller's diner. Damon's bitter parting comment lingered in the back of my mind, but for the first time in months, I did not feel threatened by him. I felt finished with the version of fear he'd spent weeks feeding. I called Marge the second I stepped onto the sidewalk. Her voice trembled with relief when I told her the full ruling, the assault charge standing permanent, the retaliatory countersuit dismissed, every medical cost covered in full. She did not celebrate loudly. She just breathed, deep and unbroken, like someone who had finally gotten back the peace they'd thought was stolen forever. I drove home slowly, taking the long suburban route past tree-lined streets and quiet neighborhood lawns. For weeks, every familiar road had felt charged, every parked car a possible threat, every unknown shadow a reason to stay vigilant. Now the world felt normal again, not perfectly safe, but reliably calm. The constant military-grade alertness I'd carried in my bones for months finally softened. In the days that followed, the aftershocks of the ruling faded fast. The anonymous licensing complaint against my consulting business was formally closed, investigators confirming it was baseless retaliatory harassment. My client roster stabilized, and the professional damage Damon had tried to carve into my life vanished entirely. Jesse returned to his regular shifts at the diner, no longer trapped between fear and conscience. He texted me once, simply saying thank you for seeing him clearly, for not writing him off when the pressure broke him. Clara finished her evening shifts undisturbed, her courage never exposed to the retaliation she'd feared. Damon's life shifted in ways he could not reverse. The permanent assault charge altered his local standing. Several small business partnerships pulled away from his contracting firm, unwilling to associate with a man proven to assault elderly civilians over trivial disputes. His reputation, built on bluster and unspoken power, crumbled quietly behind closed doors. He never returned to Miller's diner. He never sent another threat, never loitered near our homes, never tried to resume his campaign of intimidation. His power had always relied on secrecy and unchallenged control. Once it was exposed, it dissolved entirely. Marge's physical healing progressed steadily. Her wrist regained strength with physical therapy, but the invisible scars took longer to fade. For a month, she still flinched at sudden loud noises, still hesitated before stepping into crowded public spaces, still preferred staying home over dining out. I never rushed her to get over it. I simply stayed present, gave her space to heal on her own terms. Slowly, the nightmare stopped. The cautious tension in her shoulders relaxed. She began smiling again, soft and genuine, the way she had before that terrible night. 3 weeks after the hearing, I drove her back to Miller's diner on a quiet weekday afternoon. The lunch rush was long over, the dining room calm and bright, filled with the warm smell of fresh pie and brewed coffee. The same vinyl booths lined the walls, the same overhead lights hummed softly, but the space no longer felt dangerous. It no longer held the echo of her fall. Jesse greeted us at the counter with a quiet, relieved smile. He seated us at a new booth, far from the spot where the altercation had happened, and handed us our menus without a single awkward word. The air was light, unburdened. We ordered Marge's favorite soup and a slice of apple pie, and we sat together in peaceful silence, no phones, no tension, no lingering fear. As I watched my mother stir her tea gently, her healed wrist moving easily, I reflected on the person I'd been before this fight. For years after my military discharge, I'd hidden my strength. I'd softened my edges, quieted my instincts, refused to lean into the rigor and resolve that had defined my career as a Ranger captain. I'd wanted to be ordinary, to blend into civilian life, to avoid the weight of being the person who always steps forward, always carries the burden, always fixes the crisis alone. This ordeal rewrote that part of me. I learned that strength did not have to mean aggression. Resolve did not have to equal cruelty. Protecting the people you love did not make you bitter or vengeful. It made you steady. I had spent months navigating fear, isolation, betrayal, and relentless pressure, yet I had never crossed a line into cruelty. I had fought fairly, patiently, and methodically, and I had won justice without becoming the monster I'd fought against. I also learned to stop carrying every weight alone. For years, my instinct had been to shoulder every crisis solo, to refuse help, to assume reliance on others was weakness. But Becca's quiet loyalty, Jesse's risky honesty, Clara's brave testimony, and my attorney's steady guidance taught me that strength includes letting others stand beside you. I did not win this fight by myself. I won it by staying grounded enough to accept support when I needed it most. Damon never got the quiet, easy erasure of his mistake he'd spent thousands of dollars trying to buy. He faced consequences, public record, and lost influence. But I did not find joy in his downfall. There was no triumphant rush, no satisfaction in his suffering. There was only closure, the calm, unshakable peace of knowing I had defended my mother honorably, that the truth had prevailed, that no amount of money or power could overwrite simple human decency. As we finished our pie and prepared to leave the diner that afternoon, Marge reached across the table and rested her hand gently on mine. "We're okay now," she said softly. I nodded, because it was true. We were okay. Not unchanged, not entirely unmarked, but safe, healed, and whole. The world did not give us a perfect ending. It gave us a real one. Scars remained, lessons lingered, and the memory of fear would never fully disappear. But the chaos was over. The threats were gone. The quiet, ordinary life we'd cherished for years was finally ours again, and for the first time in a very long while, I did not need to stand guard. I could simply breathe, and be present, and enjoy the peaceful, hard-won calm I'd fought so tirelessly to protect.